Hello and welcome to Cheating Tales Lab. We're glad to have you with us, and we hope you enjoy the story. Let's not waste any time. Let's begin. Brett has hunched over his desk, red pen poised above a stack of history essays. The clock on the wall ticked past 11 p.m. Another Friday night, sacrificed to his job. He reached for his coffee mug, grimacing at the cold dregs within. His elbow caught the edge of Marissa's purse, sending its contents scattering across the cluttered surface. "Damn it," he muttered, setting down his pen to gather the fallen items. As he swept his hand under the desk, his fingers brushed something plastic. He pulled it out, expecting a pen or perhaps one of Marissa's countless hair ties. Instead, he found himself staring at a white stick with two pink lines clearly visible in a small window. Brett's mind went blank for a moment, then kicked into overdrive. A pregnancy test. A positive pregnancy test. He sat back in his chair, test still clutched in his hand. Memories flooded back. The hopeful starts of IVF treatments, the crushing disappointments, Marissa's tears and his own tightly controlled grief. 3 times they'd tried. 3 times they'd failed. The last attempt had nearly broken them, financially and emotionally. Brett's eyes darted to the purse. Before he could talk himself out of it, he reached in and began rifling through its contents more thoroughly. There, tucked into her wallet behind her driver's license, he found it. An ultrasound image, dated just 2 days prior. His hand shook as he held the grainy black and white photo, a blob that would become their child. Their miracle. Brett's eyes stung with unshed tears. After everything, it had finally happened. Marissa must have wanted to surprise him. Well, 2 could play at that game. A plan began forming in Brett's mind. He'd wake up early, make Marissa's favorite blueberry pancakes, maybe pick up some flowers from that little shop on the corner. They'd celebrate properly, make up for lost time. As Brett crawled into bed beside his sleeping wife, he felt lighter than he had in years. Their dream was finally coming true. Saturday morning arrived, pale sunlight filtering through the curtains. Brett eased out of bed, careful not to wake Marissa. He padded downstairs, mind already on pancake batter and the perfect cup of coffee. As he passed their home office, he heard Marissa's voice, low and urgent. Brett paused. She must have gotten up without him noticing. "I don't know what to do, Jen," Marissa was saying. Brett recognized her sister's name. "I can't keep lying to him." Brett's hand froze on the doorknob. "No, I haven't told Brett yet," Marissa continued. "How can I? You know how desperate he's been for a baby. If he finds out it's Nelson's..." The world tilted sideways. Brett stumbled back from the door, mind reeling. Nelson Haley, the drama teacher. Charismatic, handsome Nelson with his easy smile and effortless charm. I know, Marissa's voice drifted out. "I have to end things with Nelson, but you should see the way Brett looks at me now. He's so happy, Jen. I can't take that away from him." Brett found himself in the kitchen, not quite sure how he'd gotten there. The ingredients for pancakes sat accusingly on the counter. He mechanically began putting them away, movements wooden and unreal. His wife was pregnant, but not with his child, with Nelson's child, and she planned to pass it off as Brett's own. The egg slipped from Brett's numb fingers, shattering on the kitchen floor. He stared at the yellow yolk spreading across the tile. How fitting. His life, too, lay in pieces at his feet. Monday morning arrived with cruel inevitability. Brett moved through his morning routine in a daze, barely tasting his breakfast, hardly hearing Marissa's cheerful chatter about her plans for the day. The halls of Jefferson High School echoed with the usual cacophony of slamming lockers and adolescent voices. Brett nodded mechanically to passing students and colleagues, all the while scanning the crowd. There, at the end of the hallway, Nelson Haley held court, surrounded by a group of adoring drama students. He gestured animatedly, no doubt regaling them with tales of his latest theatrical triumph. Brett's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He wanted nothing more than to march down that hallway and introduce Nelson's face to the nearest locker door, repeatedly. But no, he couldn't. Not here. Not now. There was too much at stake. Brett forced himself to turn away, retreating to the relative safety of his classroom. He had a free period first thing, time enough to think, to plan. The school's ancient desktop computer wheezed to life. Brett's fingers flew across the keyboard, searching for information on paternity laws, father's rights. The deeper he dug, the more his stomach churned. Without proof of paternity, he had no legal claim to the child. Marissa could simply name him as the father on the birth certificate, even if he later proved he wasn't the biological parent. The courts tended to favor the mother in custody disputes. Brett's eyes burned as he stared at the screen. He'd always played by the rules, done the right thing, and where had it gotten him? Cuckolded in facing the loss of a child that wasn't even his. A notification popped up on his screen, a reminder from their joint bank account. Brett clicked it absently, then froze. Large withdrawals. Thousands of dollars, siphoned off over the past 3 months. Right around the time Marissa must have gotten pregnant. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Money for a secret abortion, in case she decided not to keep it. A nest egg to run away with Nelson. Brett's mind raced. He needed more information, more evidence. He couldn't confront Marissa, not yet. Not until he had an ironclad plan. The bell rang, startling Brett from his thoughts. Students began filing in, chattering and laughing. Brett pasted on a smile, pushing down the bile rising in his throat. "All right, everyone," he called out, voice steadier than he felt. "Let's pick up where we left off last class. Who can tell me about the economic factors leading to the Civil War?" As Brett launched into his lecture, a part of his mind continued to churn. He'd trusted Marissa implicitly, never questioned her faithfulness. Now he realized that trust had been his downfall. Well, no more. Brett Hess was done being the naive Boy Scout. It was time to fight fire with fire. Brett Hess stood in the electronics aisle of the local big box store, eyeing the array of security cameras with feigned interest. He'd done his research, knew exactly which model he needed. But he had to play the part of the concerned new father-to-be. "Can I help you find anything, sir?" A chipper sales associate materialized at his elbow. Brett mustered a smile. "Just looking at home security systems. My wife's pregnant, you know. Can't be too careful these days." The words tasted like ash in his mouth. His wife, pregnant, with another man's child. 20 minutes later, Brett left the store with a state-of-the-art security system. Cameras small enough to hide in plain sight, with crystal-clear audio pickup. Perfect for catching adulterers' wives in the act. Installing the cameras was almost too easy. Marissa never questioned his sudden interest in home security. She was too preoccupied with her own secrets, Brett supposed. The first day yielded nothing of interest. Marissa went about her usual routines, made a few work calls, watched some mindless reality TV. Brett was beginning to think he'd overreacted, that maybe he'd misheard that damning phone conversation. Then, on day 2, the cameras caught gold. Brett watched the footage with a kind of detached fascination. Marissa, curled up on the couch with a glass of wine, phone pressed to her ear. Her best friend Hope's tinny voice emerged from the speakers. "Still can't believe you're pregnant," Hope was saying. "How are you feeling?" Marissa sighed, taking a long sip of wine. "Honestly, terrified, guilty, excited. It's all mixed up. Have you told Brett yet?" "No." Marissa's voice was small. I can't. You know how much he wants this baby. If he knew it was Nelson's." Brett's hands clenched into fists, nails biting into his palms. He forced himself to keep watching. "You have to tell him, Risa," Hope urged. "The longer you wait, the worse it'll be." I know. It's just, you should see the way he looks at me now. Like I've given him the moon. How can I take that away from him?" The conversation devolved into more hand-wringing and rationalizations. Brett tuned it out, mind already racing ahead to his next move. He had proof now, incontrovertible evidence of Marissa's infidelity. But it wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. Brett's fingers flew across his keyboard, muscle memory taking over as he hacked into Marissa's email account. It wasn't difficult. She still used the same password for everything, their anniversary date. The irony wasn't lost on him. What he found made his blood run cold. Correspondence with an online lender, one with a reputation for being less than scrupulous. Loan applications with blatantly falsified information. This went beyond infidelity. This was fraud. Criminal activity that could land them both in serious trouble. Brett's mind whirred, weighing his options. Part of him wanted to confront Marissa immediately, to demand answers and force a confession. But the more rational part of his brain knew he needed to bide his time, gather more evidence, build an airtight case. With trembling hands, Brett composed an anonymous tip to the bank and local authorities, detailing the financial irregularities he'd uncovered. It felt like a betrayal, but he reminded himself Marissa had betrayed him first. He was just protecting himself now. The next day at school, a staff meeting was called. The principal's face was grim as she addressed the assembled faculty. As some of you may have heard, the state has announced significant budget cuts for the coming year, she began. I'm afraid this means we'll be facing some difficult decisions in the coming months. Layoffs may be necessary. A ripple of unease spread through the room. Brett's eyes darted to Nelson, noting the sudden pallor of the other man's face. Good. Let him sweat a little. As the meeting dispersed, Brett found himself cornered by Nelson. The drama teacher's usual easy charm seemed forced, his smile a touch too wide. Hey, Brett. I hear congratulations are in order, Nelson said, clapping him on the shoulder. Marissa must be over the moon. It took every ounce of Brett's self-control not to deck the man right there in the hallway. Instead, he forced a smile. Thanks, Nelson. We're both thrilled. Nelson's eyes flickered, a hint of guilt crossing his features. Listen, I was thinking. The drama club could really use a faculty advisor. Someone to help out with the administrative side of things. You interested? Brett's mind whirred. This could be an opportunity, a chance to get closer, to gather more information. You know what? That sounds great. I'd be happy to help out. As Nelson chatted excitedly about upcoming productions, Brett nodded along, all the while imagining 1,000 painful ways to make the man suffer. The trap was set. Now all Brett had to do was wait for his prey to stumble into it. The dining room was bathed in soft candlelight, the table set with their best china. Brett had outdone himself. A 3-course meal, Marissa's favorites. The perfect setting for a celebration. Marissa picked at her food, tension radiating from every line of her body. Brett watched her waiting. He'd given her plenty of opportunities to come clean over the past week. Now, it seemed, she'd finally worked up the courage. Brett, she began, setting down her fork. I have something to tell you. He arranged his features into a mask of concern. What is it, sweetheart? Is everything okay? Marissa took a deep breath. I'm pregnant. Brett let his fork clatter to the plate, arranging his features into a mask of joyful shock. What? Are you serious? He stood, pulling Marissa into an embrace. Over her shoulder, his eyes were cold and calculating. Oh my God! This is amazing! Brett exclaimed, voice thick with false emotion. When did you find out? How far along are you? He watched carefully as Marissa stumbled through her responses, noting every nervous glance, every hesitation. She was a terrible liar, really. How had he never noticed before? I can't believe it, Brett murmured, pressing a kiss to her forehead. After everything we've been through, it's finally happening. Marissa's smile was watery, guilt clouding her eyes. I know. It's a miracle. A miracle. Brett wanted to laugh, or maybe scream. Instead, he held his wife close, mind already racing ahead to the next phase of his plan. So, he said, pulling back to look at her, when did this miracle happen exactly? I mean, we haven't exactly been trying lately, what with all the stress from the failed IVF attempts. Marissa's eyes darted away. Oh, it must have been that night after Sarah's wedding. Remember? We'd both had a bit too much champagne. Brett remembered. He also remembered that Sarah's wedding had been nearly 4 months ago. If Marissa was only now announcing her pregnancy, the timing didn't quite add up, but he simply smiled, nodding along. Of course. How could I forget? It was a magical night. Marissa relaxed slightly, clearly relieved he wasn't pushing the issue. It really was. And now we have this to look forward to. Brett raised his wine glass. To our little miracle, he toasted, watching as Marissa took a sip of her water. The web of lies was growing more tangled by the day. Soon, very soon, Brett would be ready to tear it all down. The next day at school, Brett threw himself into his new role as drama club advisor with gusto. He sat in on rehearsals, offering suggestions and praise in equal measure. He helped with costumes and set design, always making sure to defer to Nelson's expertise. It was sickening, really, how easily Nelson fell for the act. The man preened under Brett's attention, clearly thrilled to have another admirer in his orbit. "You know, Brett," Nelson said one afternoon as they were striking the set after rehearsal, "I have to admit, I had my doubts when you first volunteered. Didn't really peg you as a theatrical type, but you've been a godsend." Brett smiled, the expression not quite reaching his eyes. "Happy to help. It's been enlightening." Enlightening indeed. In the weeks since he'd joined the drama club, Brett had gathered a wealth of information. He'd overheard hushed phone conversations between Nelson and Marissa, watched as they exchanged meaningful glances across crowded hallways. But it wasn't enough. He needed something concrete, something that would force the school board's hand. The opportunity presented itself in the form of Amber Callahan, a junior with stars in her eyes and a crush on Nelson a mile wide. Brett watched as Nelson lavished attention on the girl, offering private coaching sessions and gushing praise for her mediocre performances. It was all very above board, of course. Nelson was too smart to actually cross that line, but perception was everything. It took some doing, but Brett eventually managed to convince Amber's mother to file a complaint. Nothing too salacious, just concerns about the amount of time her daughter was spending alone with Mr. Haley, the way he seemed to favor her over other students. The complaint landed on the principal's desk on a Tuesday morning. By Wednesday afternoon, the school board had launched a full investigation into Nelson's conduct. Brett watched from the sidelines as Nelson's carefully constructed world began to crumble. The man was a nervous wreck, jumping at shadows and snapping at students. Good, Brett thought. Let him suffer. Let him feel even a fraction of the pain he'd caused. The pieces were falling into place. Soon, very soon, Brett would have everything he needed to bring Marissa's carefully constructed house of lies crashing down around her. "Are you sure about this?" Marissa asked, worry creasing her brow. "A whole month in D.C.? What about your classes?" Brett zipped up his suitcase, forcing a reassuring smile. "It's a great opportunity, honey. The school's already arranged for a long-term sub. And think how good it'll look for my tenure review." Marissa nodded, but the concern didn't leave her eyes. I'll miss you." For a moment, Brett almost faltered, almost believed the sincerity in her voice. But then he remembered the overheard phone calls, the secret smiles exchanged with Nelson in the school hallways. "I'll miss you too," he lied smoothly. "But it'll fly by, you'll see. And when I get back, we can start really preparing for the baby." Marissa's hand flew to her stomach, guilt flashing across her face. Right, the baby. Brett kissed her cheek, grabbed his bags, and headed out the door. But instead of driving to the airport, he made his way across town to a nondescript apartment complex. The place was small, sparsely furnished, but it would do. For the next month, this would be his base of operations. Brett set up his laptop, connecting to the feed from the hidden cameras in his house. Then he settled in to watch and wait. It didn't take long for Marissa to take advantage of his absence. The very next day, Nelson's car pulled into their driveway just after sunset. Brett watched, bile rising in his throat as Marissa welcomed her lover into their home, into their bed. Over the next few weeks, Brett meticulously documented every encounter, every hush phone call, every secret rendezvous. He compiled financial records, tracked suspicious transactions, built a case so airtight it would make a seasoned prosecutor weep with joy. And then, when he was sure he had everything he needed, Brett made his final move. It was child's play to track down Nelson's wife. Faith Haley was a well-respected pediatrician, her office just a few miles from the high school. Brett felt a twinge of guilt as he prepared the envelope. She was an innocent in all this, after all, but he squashed the feeling ruthlessly. Collateral damage was unavoidable in war. The package he sent contained irrefutable evidence of Nelson's affair, photos, video stills, transcripts of damning conversations. He included a brief, anonymous note expressing sympathy and suggesting she seek legal counsel. Then Brett sat back and waited for the dominoes to fall. He didn't have to wait long. The next day, his burner phone lit up with a text from the neighbor he'd enlisted to keep an eye on the house. Police just left. Your wife looked upset. Brett allowed himself a smile. Phase 1 complete. A few hours later, another text came through. This one from the fake email account he'd set up to communicate with the bank's fraud department. Accounts frozen pending investigation. Further action may be necessary. Perfect. The noose was tightening. Brett gave it another day before making his next move. He called Marissa, making sure to sound appropriately concerned. Honey, is everything okay? Mrs. Abernathy next door said she saw police at the house yesterday. Marissa's voice was strained, on the edge of panic. Brett, I need you to come home. Something's happened. I can't explain over the phone. Brett feigned confusion and worry. What? Marissa? You're scaring me. What's going on? Please, she begged. Just come home. I'll explain everything, I promise. Brett hung up, a sense of satisfaction settling over him. The end game was approaching. Soon, very soon, he would have his revenge. As he packed up his temporary living space, Brett allowed himself a moment of reflection. He thought of the life he'd planned with Marissa, the family they were supposed to have. All of it gone in an instant. But from the ashes of that dream, a new Brett had risen. Harder, colder, smarter. Marissa and Nelson had no idea what was coming for them, but they were about to find out. Brett's key turned in the lock, the familiar sound now carrying a weight of finality. He stepped into the house he'd once called home, bracing himself for the performance of a lifetime. Marissa sat at the kitchen table, her face pale and drawn. Red-rimmed eyes darted up to meet his, a mixture of relief and fear evident in her gaze. Brett, she breathed, rushing to embrace him. Oh, God, I'm so glad you're home. He allowed himself to be enfolded in her arms, noting the slight swell of her stomach pressed against him. The child that should have been his miracle. Now, just another lie. What's going on, Marissa? Brett asked, injecting just the right amount of concern into his voice. I got your message. Are you okay? Is it the baby? Marissa pulled back, wringing her hands. No. The baby's fine. It's everything else. Brett, we're in trouble. Big trouble. She launched into a tearful explanation of frozen bank accounts and police inquiries. Brett listened, nodding at all the right moments, his face a mask of growing concern. I don't understand, he said when she'd finished. How could this happen? Where did all that money go? Marissa's eyes dropped to the floor. I made some bad decisions. Took out some loans. I thought I could pay them back before you noticed, but... Jesus, Marisa. Brett ran a hand through his hair, the picture of a man struggling to process shocking news. How much are we talking about here? When she told him the figure, Brett let out a low whistle. Christ, that's everything we have, more than everything. Marissa nodded miserably. I know. I'm so sorry, Brett. I never meant for this to happen. Brett paced the kitchen, mind whirring. He'd anticipated this moment for weeks, planned out every word, every reaction. Now it was time to spring the trap. Okay, he said finally. Okay, we need to think this through logically. What are our options? Marissa looked up, hope flickering in her eyes. You're not leaving me? Brett knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. Of course not. We're in this together, remember? For better or worse. The irony of those words wasn't lost on him, but Marissa nodded, squeezing his hands gratefully. So, Brett continued, we need to figure out how to pay back these loans before things get any worse. Have you talked to a lawyer? Marissa shook her head. I was too scared. I didn't know what to do. Brett nodded, as if considering their options. Then, with careful hesitation, he spoke. What about the house? Marissa's head snapped up. The house? What do you mean? Well, Brett said slowly, it's our biggest asset. If we sold it, we could pay off the loans, maybe have enough left over to start fresh somewhere else. Sell the house. Marissa's voice was small, disbelieving. But where would we go? Brett shrugged, the picture of a man grasping at straws. We could rent for a while, save up, maybe move closer to your parents. They'd love to have us nearby with the baby coming. He watched as Marissa processed the idea, saw the moment when desperation overcame her reservations. You really think we could do that? She asked. Just start over? Brett nodded, squeezing her hand. I think we have to. It's our only option. Marissa was quiet for a long moment. Then, with a shaky sigh, she nodded. Okay, let's do it. Brett pulled her into a hug, allowing himself a small, triumphant smile over her shoulder. She had no idea that he'd already set the wheels in motion, that a buyer was already lined up thanks to his realtor friend Jim. As he held his wife, Brett's mind raced ahead to the next phase of his plan. The house was just the beginning. Soon, Marissa would lose everything, just as he had. Across town, in a tastefully decorated office, another scene was unfolding. Faith Haley, respected pediatrician and wife of Nelson Haley, sat across from her lawyer, a manila envelope clutched in white-knuckled hands. Are you sure about this, Faith? The lawyer asked gently. Once we file, there's no going back. Faith nodded, her jaw set in determination. I'm sure. I want him out of my life, out of my children's lives. The lawyer nodded, pulling out the necessary forms. All right then, let's begin the process of filing for divorce. We'll cite adultery as the grounds, naming Marissa Hess as the other woman. As Faith began filling out the paperwork, her hand shook slightly, but her resolve never wavered. Nelson had made his choice. Now he would face the consequences. Back at Jefferson High School, those consequences were already becoming apparent. Nelson sat in the principal's office, his usual charm nowhere in evidence as he faced the stern-faced members of the school board. Mr. Haley, the superintendent began, I hope you understand the seriousness of these allegations. Nelson nodded, sweat beading on his forehead. Of course, but I assure you, it's all a misunderstanding. I would never. Save it. The principal cut him off. We received multiple complaints about your conduct, Mr. Haley. Inappropriate behavior with students, misuse of school resources. The list goes on. Nelson's face paled. But that's not true. I've always been professional. We have no choice but to suspend you, pending a full investigation, the superintendent continued, as if Nelson hadn't spoken. Please turn in your keys and school ID. You are not to set foot on campus or contact any students until this matter is resolved. Do you understand? Nelson nodded numbly, his world crumbling around him. As he stumbled out of the office, he pulled out his phone, desperately scrolling to Marissa's number. But the call went straight to voicemail. Nelson was alone. The for sale sign stood stark against the manicured lawn, a tangible symbol of dreams destroyed. Brett watched from the window as a young couple toured the property, Jim the realtor gesturing enthusiastically. They seem nice, Marissa said softly, coming to stand beside him. Do you think they'll make an offer? Brett nodded, allowing a small smile. Jim thinks so. Said they fell in love with the place as soon as they saw it. Marissa's hand drifted to her growing belly, a gesture that no longer inspired joy in Brett, only a dull ache of betrayal. It's a good home, she murmured. I hope they'll be happy here. Brett turned to face her, steeling himself for what came next. Marissa, we need to talk. She looked up, brow furrowing at his serious tone. What is it? Did something else happen with the bank? No, nothing like that. Brett took a deep breath. I know, Marissa, about everything. Marissa's face went pale. What do you mean? In response, Brett pulled out his phone, queuing up one of the damning videos he'd captured. Marissa's voice filled the room, discussing her affair with Nelson in excruciating detail. Marissa stumbled back, horror dawning on her face. Brett, I can explain. Don't. Brett's voice was ice. Don't insult me with more lies. He pulled a thick envelope from his briefcase, sliding it across the kitchen table. Divorce papers. I'm citing adultery and financial fraud. Marissa's hand shook as she opened the envelope. Brett, please, she begged. We can work this out. I'll end things with Nelson, I swear. We can raise this baby together, be a family. That's not my child. Brett cut her off. And you're not the woman I married, the woman I loved. Tears streamed down Marissa's face. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I never meant to hurt you. Please, Brett, give me another chance. I'll do anything. For a moment, Brett almost wavered. The pain in Marissa's eyes was real, her remorse seemingly genuine. But then he remembered the overheard phone calls, the secret smiles exchanged with Nelson, the utter betrayal of everything they'd built together. It's too late, he said quietly. I've already sold the house. Marissa's head snapped up. What? But we just put it on the market. How could you? Jim's been working on it for weeks, Brett explained. The couple outside? They're here to sign the final paperwork. Weeks. Marissa's voice was faint. You've been planning this for weeks? Brett nodded. Ever since I found out about your affair. About the baby. Marissa sank into a chair, her world crumbling around her. Where am I supposed to go? That's not my problem anymore. Brett's voice was devoid of emotion. I suggest you call Nelson. I'm sure he'd be happy to take you in. Oh, wait, he added with a cruel smile. He can't. He's been suspended pending an investigation into his conduct at school. Seems someone filed a complaint about inappropriate behavior with students. Marissa's eyes widened in realization. You did this. All of it. Brett shrugged. You made your choices, Marissa. Now you get to live with the consequences. He picked up his suitcase, already packed and waiting by the door. I'm leaving for California next month. I've accepted a position at a private school in San Francisco. California? Marissa echoed, her voice hollow. You're moving across the country? Fresh start, Brett said simply. Something we both need, I think. He paused at the door, looking back at the woman he'd once loved more than life itself. Goodbye, Marissa. I hope it was worth it. With that, Brett walked out, leaving Marissa alone in the empty shell of their former life. The courtroom was packed, a mix of curious onlookers and grim-faced lawyers. Marissa sat at the defendant's table, her once stylish clothes now ill-fitting on her 7 months pregnant frame. The judge's gavel came down with a resounding crack. Marissa Hess, you have been found guilty of loan fraud. Given the extent of your deception and the amount of money involved, this court sentences you to 3 years in federal prison to be served after the birth of your child. Additionally, your teaching license is hereby suspended pending further review. Marissa's shoulders slumped, the full weight of her actions finally crashing down upon her. As the bailiff led her away, she caught sight of a familiar face in the crowd. Nelson stood at the back of the courtroom, his own appearance a far cry from the dashing drama teacher he'd once been. Unshaven, clothes rumpled, he looked like a man who'd lost everything, which Marissa realized with a sinking heart he had. Just like her, Nelson approached as Marissa was allowed a moment with her lawyer. "Marissa," he began, reaching for her hand. "I'm so sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen." Marissa jerked away from his touch. "Don't," she hissed. "Haven't you done enough?" Nelson's face fell. I thought maybe we could start over. When you get out, we could what, Nelson?" Marissa cut him off. "Be together? Play happy families? It's over. All of it." As the bailiff returned to escort her out, Marissa turned back to Nelson one last time. "Goodbye, Nelson. I hope she was worth it." Nelson watched her go, the weight of his choices settling heavily on his shoulders. He'd lost his job, his wife, his children. And now, he'd lost Marissa too. He stumbled out of the courtroom, unsure where to go or what to do next. His life, once so full of promise, had become a cautionary tale. Miles away, in a sun-drenched classroom in San Francisco, Brett Hess stood before a group of eager students. "All right, everyone," he began, a genuine smile on his face. "Let's talk about the Civil War. Who can tell me about the economic factors that led to this pivotal moment in American history?" As hands shot up around the room, Brett felt a sense of peace settle over him. The betrayal, the pain, the elaborate revenge. It all seemed like a distant memory now. After class, Brett made his way to a small office in the school's administration wing. A plaque on the door read, "Guidance Counselor." Inside, a teenager sat nervously in one of the chairs. Brett smiled warmly as he took his seat. "So, Tyler," he began, "I understand you're interested in our school's mentorship program." As the boy nodded eagerly, Brett felt a familiar surge of purpose. This was why he'd become a teacher in the first place, to make a difference, to help shape young lives. Later that evening, Brett sat at his desk, penning a letter to the local fertility clinic. He'd been making anonymous donations for months now, funding IVF treatments for couples struggling to conceive. It was his way of turning pain into purpose, of ensuring that some good came from the ashes of his own shattered dreams. As he sealed the envelope, Brett's phone buzzed with a notification, a reminder for his volunteer shift at the adoption agency tomorrow. Brett smiled, a sense of contentment washing over him. He'd survived the storm, emerged stronger on the other side. And now, finally, he was exactly where he was meant to be. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comment section. Thanks for your time. If you enjoy this story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.